I just wanted to make one point before we started. As a young farmer, I've been farming for about 7 years now on my own, so I've got a lot of skin in the game, but I think it's really important to take the fear out of it. It's like a rugby game. If you're scared of the opposition, you're never going to win. You're allowed to be nervous because that makes you better. I think it's important because there's so much negativity and stuff, and just remember the young guys do listen to that from some of their leaders, and it could actually put them off. So just think about that as we go forward, I think, But today I'm here to introduce Dave Harrison. He's a General Manager for Policy and Advocacy. So he's going to do the environmental policy, and then we'll have some question time. And then I've got Ron Pello coming up. So he's going to do the launching of the farm plan, and then we'll do some question times there. So put the floor there. Perfect. Thank you.
Where's our clicker? There we go. Afternoon, everybody. We're quite big on tradition here in Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and one of the big traditions that we've sort of developed over recent years has been that just before I speak, the Minister steals the floor and then condenses my speaking slot quite considerably. And it's good to see that we've stuck with that tradition again this year. But seriously, a lot of what I was going to say has been covered by the Minister anyway, so it should be easy to condense it down. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through 2 or 3 of the key issues that we're working on within the space of the time that I've got. And then I'm going to be around here and able to answer questions and talk to people over the course of the day. So this isn't your only opportunity to find out what we're up to anyway. So I'll start by introducing our environment strategy. So we developed this back in 2017, 2018, looking at how as a sector we wanted to position our environmental activity. We knew that it was becoming increasingly important for our farmers. We knew that we needed to step up our activity in the space, and we wanted to do it in a way that would be strategic and lead us forward and position us well for the future. And so our vision there that we've developed here, as you can see, is we want to be world-leading stewards of the natural environment and have sustainable communities. And in doing that, we have 4, we call them pillars to our environment strategy. And what we think about them is, to use Nick Beebe's word, we think of it as a bit of a holistic vision, where we have cleaner water is a pillar around fresh water. We think about carbon neutrality as another thing that's really important to us in terms of positioning for the future. Thriving biodiversity will be increasingly important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And healthy and productive soils is the last pillar there, but we don't think of them in isolation. And a good example of this is if you think about a tree, it is a biodiversity value. It has a carbon sequestration value. It can help keep the soil on your hill and keep sediment out of the water, etc., etc. So we think of it all sort of integrated and working together. What I did want to talk about as well too is just to give a little bit of understanding about what we do and I guess what our role is within the environment space. So I've used an example here which is based on essential fresh water, but this sort of approach and these places where we interact apply across a whole bunch of different things. So at the top we've got the primary regulation, or the primary legislation in this case, which is the Resource Management Act. And as has already been referred to this morning, we know that that's going to be reformed over the next year. And so we'll be actively involved in the reform of that primary piece of legislation that will drive resource management across New Zealand. Moving down to the next bit, we're talking about changes to the RMA. And again, using the fresh water example, as part of the essential freshwater package, there was amendments to the RMA to introduce the concept of a certified farm plan. And again, we were involved in helping to shape those amendments. So there's influence on the primary legislation as it started, influence on how it's amended over time. And then the next layer down, we've got the instruments that are put in place under those pieces of legislation. So the National Policy Statement for Freshwater, National Environmental Standards that impact upon winter grazing. And again, that's another one of our touch points for getting involved in terms of how those standards and how those principles and those policy statements are crafted. And then last but not least is the implementation side. So at a regional level, we're involved in the development of regional plans and advocating for sheep and beef farmers within that planning context, but also supporting sheep and beef farmers to sort of be at the table as well too and to have their voice there. So I've turned to the first of the Topics that I really want to talk about. So essential fresh water, and the snapshot there is, as the Minister said, what the proposals were aimed to do and what David Parker's ambition was essentially what he calls hold the line, which is stopping freshwater quality degradation and making immediate improvements in the short term. And then the longer term vision is to restore water quality within what he calls a generation, which is you're looking sort of 30 years or so ahead for where there are degraded catchments, where there are degraded waterways, restoring them to a level that the community is comfortable with. It was one of the biggest pieces of consultation certainly I've been involved in with beef and lamb. We had meetings up and down the country, hugely attended by farmers, because there was a lot of skin in the game, really, in terms of farmers. It was very, it was incredible, the support we had and the level of interest that were generated. And in the end, the package produced 3 proposals. So we had a new national policy statement for freshwater. We had a new national environmental standard which governed practices on farm, or certain practices on farm. And as I mentioned before, there was some changes to the RMA itself as well. I guess the key things that came out of there that were of concern to us, or that we that were highlighted in terms of our farmers' interest on this, was the stuff that was the standards that were being set around feedlots and stock holding areas, the standards around land use change, and by that I mean, excuse me, sorry, I'm getting coffee. By that I mean intensification essentially, and it's sort of moving from forestry to pasture, and then from pasture to dairy, and there was restrictions on being able to do that. Winter grazing was obviously a very big one, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. Then we had changes to the RMA itself, there was stock exclusion, which were actually regulations under the RMA, and as I said, introducing this concept of farm planning. But at a policy level, one of the really interesting things that came out of this was, well, there's a real positive in terms of focusing on ecosystem health as what you need to achieve through your freshwater planning. Which is good, because it's not necessarily the level of chemicals that you have in the water that is impacting on, that is what we need to be addressing. It is the impact of contaminants in the water on life within that waterway, and that'll vary quite differently across the place. And te mana o te wai, how do I explain that? I can't really. It's essentially basically saying that te mana o te wai is sort of recognising the mana of the waterways, and it has always been a part of the policy statement, but now it's got basically a primacy. It's the top of the chain in terms of what needs to be considered. And the 3 things I'm going to focus on now here are winter grazing, stock exclusion, and then Ron is going to talk about farm planning in due course. So the winter grazing rules, as you'll all know pretty well, I won't sort of go through this slide in any detail, but the winter grazing rules affected how much land you could use for winter grazing, where you could do it on your farm, when you had to resow, and pugging damage. And then we had the Southland Working Group, where beef+lambnewzealand, Environment Southland, all the parties that have already been mentioned as doing good stuff in this space already, worked together to develop an alternative to this. And we've just heard from the Minister that not that he's endorsed those standards or those recommendations, but that he's certainly considering them and acting upon them, which is to my mind a good thing. The process itself, I guess, it sort of demonstrates what can be done if you have industry and farming groups and NGOs around the table, and how you can achieve workable outcomes by sort of discussing things. And one of the key frustrations we've had in terms of freshwater policy development over the last little while has been feeling excluded from the table as these decisions have been made. So if over the next year, as the Minister says, they'll be working on refining these standards and improving them, I guess we just need to hope that they'll follow that Southland model rather than what they've done in the past in terms of operating behind closed doors. Stock exclusion. So Here, so by 2023, look, again, I won't read through all of this in the interest of time, but there's been timeframes set for the exclusion of cattle, deer, pigs from waterways, and it depends on the nature of your slope and depends on the nature of your farming operation as to when you've got to do this. And our big concern here is this thing, which is called the low slope map. And so what the low slope map was an attempt to or what it is, because it is still there. It's an attempt to identify the areas that have that are within 10 degrees slope and therefore will need to have some sort of fencing around it. And the concern we have with that is that the map sort of doesn't really work, in a nutshell. And I could talk all day about it, but I won't. And it's one of those situations where nobody really gets out of bed and decides that they want to do something really daft. But what's sort of been produced here is something that's really daft, and it has been because there hasn't been that conversation with people who know how things could operate to make sure that that they're going to be workable. So what we've got here is a situation where what people felt would be providing certainty and clarity to farmers has actually produced a really perverse outcome. So we've heard from the Minister that the government is willing to review that, and the government is looking at that, which is positive. But we don't know what that would look like, and it certainly didn't come across in the press release yesterday. There was no discussion about it. But I do know there is a meeting in Wellington today with Federated Farmers, DINS, and we were supposed to be there as well too, where MFE were going to talk to us about what they're thinking about in terms of reforming that map. So we'll get a readout of that in due course this afternoon, and hopefully there's some positive news. How am I doing for time?
It's on the clock.
Oh, 3 minutes?
Yep.
All right. Climate change. Okay, so look, I'll briefly go through the climate change then. So Climate Change Commission was formed under the Zero Carbon Act. Essentially the idea of it is to take the politics out of climate change policy because it's a long-term thing. A couple of weeks ago, it released its first set of draft recommendations to government, and it was seeking feedback from wider New Zealand about those recommendations. And what I've got here is, I guess, what some of our initial thinking is as we're pulling together our submissions on this. So the first thing is the good stuff, is that there's a focus on reducing fossil fuel emissions and not just offsetting. And one of the big concerns that we've heard from farmers over the course of the past 2 or 3 years has been that there's the incentives for planting native forestry on sheep and beef land in particular that are created through the ETS poses a real threat to rural communities, basically. And so while we recognise that some form of planting will inevitably need to be part of the climate change response, it's our view that that needs to be limited or regulated in some way to make sure that there's also the incentives to be reducing emissions too, and not just planting our way out of this. The second good bit is recognising the wider values of trees and native vegetation. Again, that's something that's quite close to our hearts because we have 2.8 million hectares of native vegetation on our sheep and beef farms. About half of that is essentially bush. And so we've got a great resource there that we believe it's important to recognise the wider benefit of. One of as a bit of a sideline to this, we know that later in the year there'll be another push being made on introducing a national policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity. And while on the face of it, that should be a good thing for us because of this resource that we have sitting on our farms, there's a real risk that it's actually goes completely the other way, because if it's set up in a way that the good things that people have done in the past voluntarily for good reasons are becoming a management liability, then the incentives are to take that away, essentially. So it's potentially hugely counterproductive, and so that's something we'll be working pretty hard on towards the end of the year. And the last good thing that I'll mention is recognition of smaller scale planted blocks. So within the ETS, there's a certain size and certain canopy cover that you need to have, and the Commission is saying we need to be a little bit more creative in terms of what we count towards sequestration. And the not so good stuff, We're worried that the budgets that may be set for methane could be asking agriculture to do more than it needs to. The science is telling us that a small reduction in methane and stability over time will mean that we're not contributing to warming, which is what the key issue is. But the Commission seems to be suggesting much greater reductions, which to our mind seems to be asking us to do some more heavy lifting for fossil fuel emissions, basically. And then the other one I'll just point out one other one on here too, is the other concern that we have is the reference points that the Commission use don't really recognise the historic progress that we've made as a sector. And so since 1990, we've reduced our emissions by 30% gross, and at the same time producing almost the same amount of product. So we've already done a huge amount in terms of climate efficiency, but also actual climate reduction or emissions reduction, and we need to make sure that doesn't get lost in the mix. And lastly, I'll just quickly talk about Haywork Ekinoa. So Haywork Ekinoa was an industry initiative where it is industry taking a lead role in developing climate change policy. So the government view of the day was that agriculture needed to come into the emissions trading scheme, and that the best way to do that would be to place a levy at a processor level, essentially a tax. And what the industry view was that does nothing to encourage emissions reductions on farm. There's no direct link between the good stuff that you do and what you end up having to pay. So Haywork Ekinoa was developed to try and build a system that did exactly that. But it has some pretty, I was going to say tight targets, but I'm going to say, but they're fixed targets because they are achievable, even though they are, ambitious. And probably the main one is that by 1 January 2025, that system is in place that enables each individual farm to understand its agricultural emissions and to be reporting against on that and to be held accountable for it as well too. Along the way, we need to sort of get farmers into the planning process, and so the first sort of big goal, if you like, or the big challenge for industries is by 1 January next year, 25% of farms need to know what their greenhouse gas number is and have written down what their plan is in terms of measuring that. Now, that sounds daunting, but it doesn't have to be hard. And industry groups and a number of other people are working on the calculators that are going to be simple and enable people to understand their number, making it easy to identify 2 or 3 things that you may or may not choose to do to manage your emissions and take the complexity out of the process. But the fact is, that's the target there. And as I say here, by the middle of next year, the Climate Change Commission will be undertaking a review of progress on Haywork Ekinoa, and if we're far short of our targets, then there's the risk that we go back to processor-based levy and no connection to the good stuff that you do on your farm. So that's the risk, guys. And but as I say, as industry groups, not just ourselves but others, are doing everything we can to make it as easy as we can make it to achieve those targets. And that's me.
Perfect, thank you. We'll just open the floor to some questions. If we just remember to use our name and where we're from, it's always helpful. We'll go with Olivia yep.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Dave, you just brought up about the issue of the day. Seems to be quite a lot of discussion around forestry. And I'm quite concerned, like probably a lot of people in this room, that we might experience what you could call a runaway land use change in the near future. And simply talking about something doesn't make it go away. And my concern is that you'll get farmers turning to the forestry companies for advice. And I have experience with forestry companies. They're good people. But they have a different view on looking at landscapes than we do. I would much rather them turn to, say, Beef and Lamb's environmental team for advice and give some real good holistic sound advice around that. So I know that you're running workshops around the country. Do you think you should scale those up a wee bit and have a bit more coverage to give us the right and proper information?
Yeah, look, that is a really good question, and as you've sort of referred to, we do have trees on farm workshops or trees and carbon workshops that we've been running for a couple of years. I guess in the short to sort of medium term, we've got a real focus on delivering what Ron's about to talk about in terms of farm plans, and getting everybody with a plan that sort of, maps out what their natural resources are and provides a bit of a sort of pathway over time to develop it. So in terms of providing expertise around how you integrate trees into your farming business, I think that's probably the vehicle we'll be focusing on in the short to medium term. But I agree, it's important for us to be giving that advice.
Yeah, people not to give it to. Graham Evans from Haywork. I'm about to harvest 20 hectares of trees. I've got a fair understanding of the global warming effect from methane. It's a warming effect. It lasts carbon's $40 a tonne today. That makes methane $1,000 a tonne because it's 25 times. We've been told by Greenpeace and the Greens that we're paying into this ETS scheme for our animals, correct? Therefore, I'm assuming that the warming effect of our methane emissions is tied up in trees planted on land owned by Jeanette Fitzsimon's estates, Rob Donald's estates, Green Party's friends. So if that's tied up in there, that should be locked there forever. So when you want me to say, what's my greenhouse gas emissions from methane, I'm going to say 0 because the taxpayer has been paying this for a long time now. That's the warming effect of my methane emissions off my sheep. And that means that it can upset a lot of people.
Question, Graham.
I want to know, I will put down 0 on my methane emissions because they're locked up in trees on somebody else's land. I purchased those through the as a taxpayer. So I expect to be able to write down 0 for methane emissions.
The one thing I would say to that is just probably a clarification of the start of the comment really is that the point of Haywork Ekinawa is to avoid an ETS in which that's capturing agricultural methane, and it's to find a way that sort of recognises what is sequestering on our farm at the same time as offsetting what we are producing. So that I just wanted to clarify that.
Got one more down here.
Oh, introduce myself. Leon Black from my mother and father. Dave, just a question about relationships with working. The most important concern should be the lack of livestock on New Zealand communities in the future based out of the potential tax and this sort of exercise. Are you working with the meat industry and the companies? Because if you're talking about getting a wider coverage, they take our goods. In 5 years, if those animals aren't coming off the hills, they won't have a business. So are they working in collaboration with you to get the information we need?
Absolutely, in a bunch of different ways. So we have direct conversations with the Meat Industry Association around climate change policies in a general sense, but also, again, coming back to the Haywork Ekinawa partnership that's trying to devise a more effective and reasonable way of dealing with agricultural greenhouse gases. MIA is a party to that as well too. So the very point you make is that around the processes have an awful lot of skin in the game in this as well is pretty well understood by them, I think. Hey, Grant.
No, thank you. That was really good. We'll move on. I just wanted to thank the Beef and Lamb staff myself as well. I just can't believe how much they get done for the amount of money they get there. So, yeah, I just thought, I know it's been rung up a couple of times, but I also wanted to make mention of that. The other thing I wanted to make mention of is I'm a really proud farmer, and all this environmental and stuff, I know it's not going to be easy going forward, but I'm still proud of where we are, and I'm proud of where we're going to be going forward. So anyway, I'll push on. I'll invite Ron Pillow up, and he's going to talk us through the Beef and Lamb's new farm planning.
Kia ora koutou. It's a privilege to be here with you today and to be able to take you through the farm plan, the new farm plan that we have been working to update for you. And it's my pleasure to take you through that, privilege to take you through that, and look forward to some question and discussion with you shortly on it. So I want to start just by reinforcing some of the outcomes that we're looking for in terms of farm planning, and that's in essence that we're looking at further documenting farm planning. That's the essence of what farm planning is really about. So we want every farm, commercial farm, to have a recorded active farm plan that provides you opportunity to meet with regulatory and market requirements. But it's got to be through a simple process. It's got to be streamlined. And farm planning at the end of the day is about helping make better decisions on farm. It's about ensuring that we've got the information there to make our business more resilient, ensure we can make better decisions on a day-to-day basis, and help tell our story as we go through that. There's some background that's been critical in terms of getting us to this point, and some of it's been raised already today. Certainly Essential Fresh Water has some components where it asks us to have farm plans. We've just heard about He Waka e Kanoa, or been reminded about He Waka e Kanoa, which has, amongst other things, a target, a requirement that we have a plan to measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions on farm. 25% of farms by the end of this year, and all farms by the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025. MPI, we heard how they have a vision around integrated farm plans. Regional councils use the word to mean various requirements in terms of farm planning. And of course, within beef and lamb, there's been a lot of use and uptake and understanding built through the LEP 1, 2 and 3 process. And that's all background to where we are today with regard to farm planning. What I want to do is show you where we are now taking the farm plan process within beef and lamb. And this is the overall structure that we're working towards. We've taken the former LEP material, we've embedded it within an overall farm planning structure. But it all starts with your vision. What's your vision for your farm? What are the core details and resources that you have? Who are the people involved with your farm? We want to document that. You'll have that, you'll know that, but we want to help document that so that that becomes the overarching place that all the other material within our farm plan sits under or sits within. We see the opportunity to have a range of modules within this farm plan. The first one very clearly, the environment module, and that, as I say, has been built from the former LEP material. But there's scope to also have, for example, a biosecurity module, a people management module, maybe animal welfare. Maybe you embed your health and safety plan that you already have within this farm planning framework because it naturally fits there. As I say, it's about further documenting, having an active recorded farm plan. That's our goal. Nothing more extraordinary, but simply further documenting what we're doing with planning to help guide good decision making. We want to focus on the environment module today to give you a bit of an idea and a flavour of what that looks like. And so we have a range of chapters within the environment module, covering the things that you'd expect to see within there. Managing soil health, freshwater ecosystem health, integrating native biodiversity, responding to climate change, waste and chemical management, forage cropping, and for those where it's important, irrigation management. Those are all things that enable us to identify core resources that fit within the environmental aspects of our farm, identify the risks and opportunities within those aspects, and then create action plans that help us address those opportunities within our farm business. And we want to give you the opportunity to work through those chapters one by one, or go directly to the ones that are of most relevance to your business and where you're at this point in time. And maybe come back to the others at a later point in time, or start them and add more detail as it becomes important to you. So to make this happen, we envisage a process with some preparation, some workshops and documentation. And so we want to invite you shortly to a range of workshops to come and engage with us and understand the material. But before you come, we would like you to think about some of that material that will ultimately land in your farm plan, and gather things like maps, document your farm vision, collect the soil tests, maybe a nutrient budget if you've got it. Pull that material together, which will fit into your farm plan. Then we want to take you out on farm and work through some of the technical material with you that will inform your farm plan. Work through things like a visual soil assessment, a stream health check, to help document some of those things that will lead to identifying those risks, actions, and what review processes look like. We'll have a couple of workshops, and the second one will enable a lot more flexibility to address the things that are most important to the group that you're working with and critical to the documentation of your plan. And the final part of putting in place is the actual documentation. And we're working through a normal plan, do, review, or document risks, work through a response plan, assess and monitor, and then the annual review, a standard planning approach, but documented as it's appropriate for your farm with the items and risks, opportunities that are most critical and have the biggest gain for your business and where you're at. And of course, we want an annual review within that, which is about refining how things have worked, where we can make further gains, and building that into our new plan for further implementation. So I'd like to take you through an example for this. And as always, we want to start with the date. When did we put this together? Our farm vision and the values. I might flick it back off that. It's a little bit strange looking at that pointer. But look, we want to start always with documenting or pulling out that documented farm vision. What is it we're here for? What's critical to us? Because that drives all the behaviour, all the action that lead to the good practice, lead to the outcomes that we're all looking for. And all of the components of a good farm plan are embedded underneath or within those things around your vision and your values, your available resources. That helps define what we have, what we want to do, where we can most impact what's in front of us. The way we want to describe resources is based on land management units. What are the core aspects of the various parcels of land that we have? How can we group them together in ways that make logical sense in terms of their risks and opportunities and how we can best use them to deliver on our farm vision? What are those core things that fit together? And so what are the strengths and weaknesses within each of those blocks? What are the uses and management that those parcels of land are best suited towards? And focus our attention on those risks and opportunities. And of course, often what we're doing is simply documenting the knowledge that you've built up over years of managing and working with parcels of land. Remember, we're largely looking to document the things that you know and do well, but use that documentation to make better decision making going forward. And then we get into our actual forage cropping module, our actual detail around forage cropping. And this is where intensive winter grazing will fit. And the module that was just talked about in terms of how we make sure we address the risks that have been raised and importantly ensure that we're doing our part to look after the wider environment that we farm within. So it's always good to start with why. When we're thinking about our forage cropping chapter in our environmental plan and our farm plan, why are we forage cropping? What is it adding to our business? And then we want to consider the risks that are associated with it, ideally again by those groups of paddocks and the risks and characteristics that are defined by those. We then can start working through those. And so what you've got there is, for example, as we think about sediment and phosphate risk, what are the risk factors that feed into that? Is it slope? Is it erosion? Is it overland transport risk? And how does those things change across my different land management units? How will my management practices then change across those aspects? So identifying and recording those things is a big part of the process of landing where we want to with an action plan. Because now we've got those identified risks, we can start documenting our actions to address those risks. And not only the actions, but whereabouts do those exist? What's the time frame? When are we going to do them? Who's going to be responsible? Again, we're documenting those things that will drive better behaviours, better outcomes for our wider catchment. And that's what a documented active plan's all about. Identifying those risks, addressing the things that we can, and ensuring we're contributing to the environmental goals that we all have. And then, of course, we can create a nice graphical image, a relatively simple picture that describes what's going on in regard to that paddock, that land management unit, that defines the key risks, the practices we put in place to address those risks, so that it's there in front of us, easy to share with other people, whether that's staff, contractors, whoever that might be, to show how we've thought about addressing the risks and opportunities in front of us. And we'll be working further, as you've heard from today's announcements, to make sure that this process addresses the criteria that were asked of us, to ensure that this is simple and straightforward and easy to adopt and implement on farm, to address those aspects raised through the Southland Working Group, and largely that is how this has come about. So, through that, we hope that we will meet the requirements of what is asked for within the regulation, and as that is amended out of the announcements we've heard in the last 24 hours, we'll be working closely with regional councils and the other parties involved to make sure that what we've got in place is something practical, workable, simple, and, as we all want, achieving the real outcomes in our catchment and our environment. We also want to acknowledge that for many of you, you've been on this journey for quite some time. You may have an LEP 1, 2 or 3. You may have a regional council-based farm plan. You may have a bespoke farm plan. What the beef and lamb farm plan that we're launching today does for you is enables you to check the things that are now in the farm plan against what you've currently got, use it as an opportunity to update where you are, make sure all of the things that are available to us are considered and embedded within your farm plan. We also are working towards an online plan, but to Graham's question earlier, there's no piece of paper big enough to capture all the information in his head on a farm plan. But we do want it to be simple and straightforward, which will mean for some things like that paddock diagram that captures the key things in relation to that on one page. We're also working closely with FAP to make sure that within FAP Plus that we've got a streamlined process, because again, farm planning is about that documentation that leads to better business and helps us capture market value, helps us capture gain across our whole business. It's not a document that just addresses one aspect that we're asked to. No, this is about ensuring our whole farm business is delivering in the best possible way for us. So we will have an online version in time. Look forward to bringing that to you at another point. We want to start with inviting you to some workshops to work through some reference material and create your farm plan, because this is the bit that will make the difference for you. I want to leave you with this quote and take some questions in a couple of minutes. Plans are nothing, planning is everything. This is what we're really wanting to work with you on, is it's about the thinking, the action that comes through further documenting where we're at. Remember, our goal is to help make sure we've got a recorded active farm plan that provides farmers the opportunity to meet regulatory and market requirements and have that documented in the near term.